So thank you so much to Olivia for the chance to present and participate in this conference. It's been really interesting, although early in the morning. So I'm going to shift gears and go back to the COVID-19 pandemic and talk specifically about implications for disability insurance, which has been mentioned a couple of times by some of the speakers. So before I talk about what happened with the pandemic specifically, I just want to kind of briefly rewind and talk just a little bit about recent trends in SSDI on the eve of the COVID pandemic. And this is just because, the trends sort of like leading into the pandemic were very different from, the experience from the past several decades, from the early 1980s on. And so I just want to kind of remind people what the picture was like, right before COVID happened. So then we'll talk about COVID, and then I'll conclude by just talking a little bit speculatively about, what might happen in the future in terms of COVID potentially changing the work environment and how that might affect people with disabilities and their opportunities going forward. So what was happening to the SSDI caseload in recent years before the pandemic? So this figure shows the number of SSDI beneficiaries every year between 2001 and 2019 on the solid blue line. And we see that the SSDI caseload actually peaked in 2014 after decades of increasing numbers since the early 1980s. And it slowly started declining after that until 2019 when I cut this off, and then we'll talk a little bit about what happened after that. So changes in the stock of beneficiaries are determined both by the flow of new beneficiaries into the program, which is the dotted green line, and the flow of exits from the program, which is the dashed red line here. So we see that the recent caseload decline was driven both by fewer new awards and more exits. So the number of new awards likely dropped to a combination of improving economic conditions after the Great Recession and also policy changes that effectively tightened standards for disability determination at the appellate level. And exits, so the vast majority of exits are from people who are converting to the full retirement age, to old age Social Security benefits, or the death of the beneficiary. And then a small number of people also, have their benefits ceased due to medical improvement after an unfavorable continuing disability review. But I think it's instructive to focus in on this very small number of beneficiaries who actually exited due to successful return to work. So in this figure, we zoom in on that type of exit, which accounts for about 0.5% of beneficiaries. But you can see here that number actually nearly doubled since 2013. So something seems to be going on that's not just related to policy changes, but potentially the work environment itself. And so one possibility is the strong labor market during the recent expansion prior to the pandemic drove this trend in work exits. And in fact, during this period, there was actually a remarkable and sort of unexpected increase in employment among people with disabilities more generally. So this figure shows the employment rate for people with and without work-limiting disabilities from 1988 to 2020, just before the pandemic, using data from the CPS. And the shaded areas denote the timing of recessions. So for comparison, we can see the employment rate of people without disabilities in the blue line, and it's been relatively flat over this period, although of course, fluctuating with recessions. And you can see that the increase in employment among those with disabilities is relatively, much larger than the increase or the change in employment among people without disabilities in the sort of recovery period from the Great Recession. So, this is all speculative, but it could point to structural changes in employers' willingness to hire people with disabilities. And that could be what is, leading or was leading them to sort of, stop applying for the program in record numbers. So before COVID, a lot of the discussion about trends into SSDI participation was about trying to understand whether that recent downturn in applications and beneficiaries was a blip or a sign of, the new normal. So enter COVID. I know you've seen several versions of figures like this over the past couple of days, but this figure basically shows the official BLS unemployment rate from January 2002 to January 2020, which is when I pulled the data. So this was a huge economic shock, and it's natural to ask whether we might be able to take lessons from the previous recessions to understand what this might mean for the SSDI caseload numbers in the short and the long run. So what would we expect based on past recessions? So there's a really large literature showing a positive relationship between both SSDI applications and awards and the unemployment rate. So Bob mentioned that, awards kind of lag applications, quite a bit, but recent research has shown that actually some of these new induced applications do in fact end up, receiving benefits in the end. So compared to the Great Recession, the recent rise in unemployment was much greater and much more compressed. But a lot of the fundamentals look the same as in previous recessions. So employment losses, for example, were concentrated among those with less education, and education is a factor in disability determinations for people who make it to the sort of vocational grid step. For those of you who know a lot about that. So in the conference paper, we performed a back of the envelope calculation where we just sort of projected forward the relationship between unemployment and SSDI apps and awards from the previous recession. In that case, we would expect something about the quarter of the size of the effects of the Great Recession. So maybe 250,000 new SSDI applications would be induced potentially just based on economic conditions alone. And then, of these, you might expect 100,000 new beneficiaries. But on the other hand, there are a lot of factors that make the most recent recession different from other recessions. As has been talked about. So unprecedented government assistance, but also just the pandemic itself, introduced new health risks that sort of weren't around, before. And so, people with disabilities are, of course, particularly vulnerable. And so that might affect, their willingness to, stay at work versus, apply for benefits. So you might actually expect there might be even more sensitivity. And then, of course, COVID also affects mortality and morbidity. So mortality is sort of offsetting from a program financing perspective. People dying earlier than they would have, frees up, money to be spent on other things, which is kind of horrible. But morbidity could further increase applications. So we hear a lot about long haulers and the sort of challenges that they face remaining in the workforce. And so we might expect, these people to apply for disability benefits. So one really important factor that's crucial to understanding what happened with disability insurance applications during this time is the widespread closure of SSA field offices during the pandemic. So previous research by Deshpande and Lee found pretty significant effects of SSA field office closures on DI applications and awards during the pre-pandemic experience. So it suggests that their research suggests that physical access to these offices and the SSA personnel, could be critical, and that it actually disproportionately affects individuals with more severe impairments, not less. So far, there's actually been no discernible increase in DI applications, and the number of beneficiaries has continued to fall. So this is, data that I pulled from earlier this month from just the SSA kind of official, workload statistics. So the blue line is monthly applications, and you see that it still hasn't seemed to kind of, go up. And the orange line is beneficiaries, which has continued to fall. Kind of maybe it blipped up a little bit and then kind of went down, most recently. And some corroborating work by Gopi Shah-Goda, Lauren Nicholas, I have to remember all the co-authors, Emily Jackson and Sarah Stith. So they actually formally examined DI applications, among other things, using CPS and SSA administrative data during the pandemic, and found declines in DI applications through the first year of the pandemic. And interestingly, they also, I think, found a decline in like Google Trend searches for DI as well. So it's not, it's not necessarily all program access. It's a little bit of a kind of mystery. So finally, the COVID pandemic had really just such a profound impact on how people do work, and especially where people do they work. It's reasonable to expect that there may be actually long-lasting effects of the pandemic on the nature of work itself, which could in turn affect employment opportunities for people with disabilities and sort of continue some of those trends that we saw, potentially before the pandemic, or even accelerate them, right? So, for example, employers may be more willing to provide accommodations that benefit for people with disabilities, and telework is kind of the big one here that could really open up opportunities. So, on the other hand, telework is only possible for certain kinds of jobs, and research by Cruz and others has found that those types of jobs tend to be, less concentrated among people with disabilities. And then also telework, of course, depends on internet access, which also is less prevalent among people with disabilities. So there's sort of I mean, I feel like with everything here, it's basically on the one hand, on the other hand, and I have 20 hands, with everything kind of going in different directions. So another factor, of course, is that COVID, potentially accelerated adoption of automation, right? Employer automation of tasks and robotization. So, when we go to the grocery store, now we often do kind of self-checkout lines, and we briefly become employers or employees of the firms. So of course, this could go in the opposite direction. And then finally, of course, all these changes in, the way that we do work could, kind of accelerate or reinforce existing trends towards work becoming more sedentary and requiring some greater cognitive abilities over time. So I'm just, briefly kind of plopping in a slide from some ongoing research with Nicole Massis and Italo Lopez Garcia, where we looked at changing job requirements for people from 2003 to 2018, which sort of spans the length of the period that we have the ONET, the Occupational Information Network. I should have checked what that stood for before trying to give you the acronym. But basically, it's a database of occupational characteristics, including some requirement characteristics. And actually, we found that jobs have become more cognitively demanding, for everyone, but even more cognitively demanding for people with high school, or some college, so less education. And then, when we talk about the physical demands that have been declining over time, we actually found that this, wasn't really detectable among people with lower education, that it was pretty concentrated among people with higher education. So basically, the higher educated people get the sort of burden of not as much cognitive increase, but quite a lot of decrease in their physical demands. And on the other hand, people with lower education have more cognitively demanding jobs without the benefit of any kind of decrease in physical demands. So just to wrap up. The pandemic has had really profound and complex effects on the labor market and society generally. A lot of these effects go in opposite directions in terms of their expected effects on opportunities to work or claim disability insurance benefits. And the effects, of course, are not just short-lived, but likely to be long run as well. And so I think we just kind of have to see, even 2 years into this pandemic, how the effects of COVID on health and work environments will end up kind of playing out and adding up to each other. So, I feel like yesterday there was a lot of depression going around. There's definitely a lot of bad things that happened over the last couple of years. But at the same time, there are potential, opportunities here to continue some of the positive trends we saw, before the pandemic, and thinking about, how our workspaces have expanded and changed to accommodate, the recession, the pandemic itself, could kind of bleed into, opportunities for people with disabilities that they sort of didn't have before. And so maybe we can have another strong recovery for people with disabilities like we did last time. So thank you very much.